In the autumn of 1923, during a quiet renovation meant only to stabilize the rotting beams of Oldham Orphanage's western wing, a government clerk named Edward Barrow was tasked with cataloging furniture for auction. The place had been shuttered for nearly 20 years, left to peel and flake into memory. Its windows were nailed shut, the dust hanging thick like old breath, and the floorboards gave off an unnatural warmth when stepped on, as if they hadn't quite let go of what they once witnessed. Edward wasn't the superstitious type. His job was numbers, ledgers, simple documentation. But something about the chapel office made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way the morning sun refused to enter through the stained glass window, or how the scent of mold seemed drowned beneath something sickly sweet, like syrup masking rot. When he pulled the desk away from the wall, a dry snap echoed under his hands. A drawer he hadn't noticed before jolted open just a sliver, splinters tearing free as if resisting. Inside was a book that didn't belong there, or anywhere. The ledger looked untouched by time. Its leather cover was uncracked, spine firm, and its clasp sealed with a lock that had no key. Edward hesitated, but a part of him, maybe the part that still remembered losing his own sister in a hospital that misplaced her paperwork, decided to pry it open. He used a screwdriver and a steady grip, and the lock gave way, not with a snap, but a sigh. Inside, the pages were lined with names, each penned in the same gentle cursive, each dated with an exact hour of arrival. The ink was dark, fresh-looking, unmarred by age or mildew. Edward flipped page after page, a strange chill creeping up his spine as he realized the list went back years. But not in the way it should. The children, he would later discover through cross-referencing old county burial records, had all died before their so-called admissions. Some had been buried in distant villages, others in mass graves marked only by the year. Yet here they were, listed neatly as if they'd walked into the orphanage weeks or even days after their death certificates had been signed. Not one child's entry bore any correction, and not a single page was torn. He brought the ledger back to the council archives, expecting disbelief, even ridicule. Instead, the room fell quiet. An archivist named Lillian cross-checked the names and dates against their burial database. What she found made her go pale. One girl, Hannah Whitlow, had died of pneumonia in 1908, but the ledger listed her as arriving at Oldham on April 3, 1913, 5 years after her coffin had been lowered into the ground at St. Mary's. Another, James Cutter, was listed as an obedient arrival in 1911, though the boy had drowned in a well 3 towns over in 1906. The phrase obedient arrival would repeat more than once, always beside the neatest entries, as if obedience could be posthumous. Someone had gone to disturbing lengths not only to recreate the presence of these children, but to do so with methodical control, assigning them roles, bed numbers, even marks for behavior. One line read, "Simon Hales, quieted by warmth, eyes sealed, compliant ever since." It was unclear whether this referred to a punishment or a state of death. Edward stopped reading after that. The ledger was placed in restricted custody, labeled non-functional artifact, and sealed in archival storage. But those who touched it reported strange things: headaches, nosebleeds, dreams of tight wooden beds and invisible hands. A few claimed to see names change slightly between readings. What began as cataloging furniture ended in a formal internal investigation, though the results were buried under layers of bureaucratic silence. The orphanage remained closed, its renovation halted indefinitely. Yet the desk remained, bolted to the floor like it had always been part of the structure. And the drawer, the one Edward swore was locked, now swung open without resistance. Inside it lay no ledger, no book at all, just the faint imprint of something heavy that had once pressed down into the wood, as if the weight of false names could leave scars even paper couldn't carry. and though no children ever returned, townspeople whispered of seeing lights behind boarded windows and shadows that moved too slowly for the wind. There was no official documentation of her hiring, no payroll entry, no city ledger with her name. Yet for more than a decade, Miss Eunice Gray had ruled Oldham Orphanage with a kind of invisible authority, stamped into every page that recorded the decline and disappearance of its children. Her initials, E.G., appeared in perfect penmanship beside dozens of injury reports, sickness logs, and disciplinary actions. But there was no personnel file, no application, not even a photograph in the yearly staff portraits. Her presence lived only in whispers and documents no one remembered submitting. When archivists tried to locate a birth record or professional reference, they found only gaps. Pages torn clean from nurse registries, census logs that skipped the house where she was said to have lived, a trail of polite vanishing. Those who recalled her did so with the uneasy reverence people give to authority that hides behind grace. She was soft-spoken, never raised her voice, and carried a small leather-bound prayer book tucked against her chest. Children said she never blinked during prayer. Townsfolk remembered seeing her at Mass, seated in the back pew, always in the same posture, back straight, eyes lowered, fingers hidden beneath spotless gloves. The gloves never changed, white as paper, tightly fitted. A seamstress once claimed to have made them dozens of pairs, each one stitched with a strange inner lining, almost like gauze soaked in wax. She said Miss Gray never gave her measurements, only brought the gloves of a child to replicate, but slightly larger. No one thought to ask why. Her role at Oldham was undefined. Officially, she was not on record. Unofficially, she was the one who decided which children received treatment and which were declared quieted. The term wasn't medical, it appeared in red ink on forms forged to mimic county health templates. Quieted due to complications, one said, signed E.G. Quieted following moral distress, read another. Some children were marked as unresponsive due to soul retreat, a phrase no licensed physician had ever used, but one repeated often in her records. The town doctor, who had visited the orphanage only twice, later told an inquest that Miss Gray had instructed him not to disturb the children during their hour of divine recovery, and refused to let him inside the infirmary without soaking his hands in a jar of crushed lilies and vinegar. He left both times unsettled, never returned. Some survivors remembered the way she touched them, always through fabric, never bare-handed. They said her fingers were gentle but cold, and that her breath carried the scent of milk left too long on the stove. One girl, now grown, said Miss Gray once cupped her chin and whispered a hymn not found in any book, each word sounding like a warning dressed as comfort. Another recalled being made to kneel for hours beside a basin of white ash, told not to move until the ash turned dark. It never did, but the girl's knees still bore marks shaped like rope loops. Miss Gray's voice was remembered as calming, her footsteps silent, her punishments wrapped in the language of care. She never struck, never screamed, never ran. She simply corrected. When questioned later, elderly staff offered conflicting answers. Some swore they'd worked beside her, that she handled the night watch and the weaker children. Others claimed she was a ghost story made up to explain missing names. One janitor said he'd seen her once standing still in the main hall during a thunderstorm, her gloves glistening like glass, unmoving for 3 hours straight. The next morning, 7 children had new bandages and no memory of injury. Despite repeated searches, her quarters were never found. Yet in every inspection log, someone had signed off her room as secure. She lived in margins and memories, never confirmed, never confronted. And yet every child who vanished bore her initials. Every silenced scream passed through her hands, covered always in white. By the time they were old enough to remember anything at all, most of the children had already learned that sound was a dangerous thing. Crying wasn't forbidden at Oldham Orphanage. It was something deeper than that. It simply stopped happening. Not from fear, but from practice. The silence there wasn't empty. It had weight. It lived in the hallways like a breath held too long. Survivors, now bent with age and minds worn thin, spoke not of beatings or screams, but of long stretches of stillness, where time moved but no one else did. They called it the hour of stillness, and it came every day just before dusk, when the light outside turned a sickly gold and the long corridor shadows began to touch. During the hour of stillness, children were lined against the walls, back straight, arms at their sides, eyes wide open but never moving. No sounds were allowed, not from breath, not from throat, not even the shuffle of a shoe. Some said it lasted 10 minutes, others said it was longer. But the time wasn't what mattered. It was what happened if you failed. If your mouth quivered, if your knees bent, if you blinked twice in the wrong rhythm. You were taken to the sewing room beneath the stairwell. They called it threading. They didn't call it punishment. Miss Gray referred to it as correction. Children who came back from it, if they came back, never cried again, not even in sleep. The threading room was never officially listed in the orphanage blueprint, but those who had been inside described it the same way. It was small, no larger than a closet with a single wooden chair bolted to the center. Above it, a lamp hung low, fitted with a black cloth that filtered light into something thin and mean. Along the wall, needles were pinned into soft white cloth, each one marked with a name, or at least what remained of one. Sometimes just a letter or a number or a shape no one understood. The process was precise. The child was told to close their mouth. A fine silver wire, cold and coated in something oily, was looped through their lips, not deep enough to sever, just enough to sting, to mark. The wire wasn't tied shut. That came later, once the lesson had been recited. The lesson was always the same. The child was made to repeat a phrase: "Noise is the crack in the skin where rot grows." After that, the wire was tightened, not enough to bleed, just enough to press, just enough to remind. Some children kept the thread in for hours, others were forced to sleep with it. And once it was removed, they spoke less, ate slower, blinked with hesitation. One survivor recalled that she forgot how to laugh, not because of the pain, but because no one around her remembered the sound of joy. The worst part, they said, wasn't the threading itself. It was what came after. The way Miss Gray would hold their face in her gloved hands, tilt their chin up and smile as she whispered, "Now you are smooth." She used that word often, smooth, as if children were meant to be polished, scrubbed clean of edges, voices, tears. The younger the child, the easier they were to make smooth. And the youngest, the infants and toddlers, they stopped crying altogether. No wails echoed through the nursery, no whimpers came from the infirmary. Even death happened in silence. One nurse, long dead now, once confessed in a letter that she checked on a boy 3 days after he died, thinking he was asleep. She wrote, "He was so quiet I thought he was cured." At Oldham, the absence of crying was praised. It meant order, it meant peace, it meant the stillness was working. But the survivors, those who made it out, still flinch at sudden sounds. Their silence was not discipline. It was something learned, stitched into them thread by thread, until the only thing they knew how to be was still. Beneath the cracked stone floor of the orphanage chapel, behind a warped wooden panel carved with faint symbols no one could translate, there was a door that didn't open unless pulled from the left. Most staff never knew it was there. Those who did were told never to mention it. It led to a room with no windows, no heat, and no air that moved. The children called it The threading room, though no one ever said the name out loud. The walls were covered in pale cloth, and pinned into it were hundreds of long, polished needles, each one resting in perfect rows like tools waiting for the next ritual. They weren't the kind used for mending clothes. They were thinner, sharper, and greased with a cloudy oil that smelled faintly of copper and flowers. These needles were meant for skin, not to pierce and sew in the way of healing, but to bind a mouth shut without breaking the body. To make silence a physical thing. When a child was chosen, they were not dragged. They were called. The phrase used was always the same. It's your time to be refined. The child would walk alone down the back stair of the chapel, trembling but silent, already halfway compliant before the ritual even began. The chair in the center of the room was old, leather worn down to its bones, but the straps were new, changed often, and always cold. The child was not spoken to once they were secured. Instead, the room fell into stillness, and Miss Gray, or someone unseen who carried out her will, began the process. The mouth was not forced open. The lips were pressed together gently, and the first needle entered near the corner, threading silver wire through the soft skin and drawing it out the other side. Not deep enough to damage, but precise enough to seal. The threading continued stitch by stitch until the mouth looked as though it wore a cruel smile bound shut by threads too delicate to break. The child was left that way for hours, sometimes days. No food, no speech. Breathing only through the nose, and even that was expected to be quiet. The stitching wasn't knotted. That came later during the final part of the ritual. Miss Gray, if present, would press her gloved hand to the child's chest and whisper something in a language that didn't quite sound like Latin but shared its rhythm. Then she would tie the thread into a small loop beneath the chin and say, "Now the scream belongs to you." That phrase appeared in several hidden documents, always in the same cursive. It was never explained. Some children broke early. Their mouths tore slightly, blood dampening the wire. They were labeled fractured vessels in the private logs and sent to isolation for rethreading. Those who endured the full duration were called sealed. Their records were often marked with a symbol resembling a closed eye. Years later, when remains were exhumed beneath the chapel, 6 skulls were found with faint grooved marks around the jawline, bone worn down by repeated pressure. Experts first assumed it was from tight bindings or illness. Then one pathologist suggested it looked more like the erosion left behind by wire pulling through cartilage too many times to heal. No one ever found the original source of the ritual. There were no books, no manuals, just scattered journal pages signed with the same initials. Some entries spoke of the containment of decay, as if sound itself was a sickness. Others described the body as a vessel too leaky to carry discipline. One entry simply read, "If the scream stays inside, the rot cannot pass." Miss Gray never claimed authorship, but the handwriting matched her known signatures, and those who survived threading never truly escaped it. Their mouths healed, but their speech came back twisted, clipped, hesitant, burdened by pauses that didn't need to exist. One child never spoke again, not from trauma but by choice. They believed even decades later that any word spoken too quickly might tear the stitch that still lived somewhere inside them. The cabinet was hidden behind a false panel in the east hallway, near the old laundry chute where children once whispered stories of bodies dropped instead of blankets. It was discovered by accident when a restoration worker leaned against the wall and felt it give under his weight with a hollow thud. Behind it, the air was cold and dry, like a place untouched by time or breath. The cabinet itself was tall and narrow, carved from dark wood, its handle rusted shut until forced open. Inside were rows of flat drawers, each lined with red velvet and arranged with care that bordered on reverence. What lay in those drawers was not clothing, not records, not tools. but paper dolls, hundreds of them. Cut with precision, folded at the edges, each one marked with a name handwritten in careful cursive. Every name belonged to a child who had vanished from Oldham. The dolls were not ordinary. They were not toys. They were thin but heavy, their weight unnatural for paper. When tested later, forensic analysts confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The fibers were soaked with calcium phosphate, bone dust, human, sifted and mixed into the pulp before drying. Some dolls bore symmetrical limbs and clean faces, their features drawn gently as if lovingly remembered. Others had their arms torn off, their heads scorched black with burn marks, or their eyes scratched out with fine lines that dug deep into the paper. Each injury matched the fate of a missing child. One doll, found in the 6th drawer from the top, was folded in half and sealed shut with wax. When carefully opened by gloved hands, it revealed the faint imprint of a child's scream. Not a sound, but a shape. The crease warped as though even paper tried to recoil from what it had recorded. There was no documentation for the dolls, no logbook or purpose stated. But written in chalk behind the cabinet's back panel was a phrase, "They stay real if they stay flat." Investigators debated whether it was a child's coping mechanism or a code from whoever created the dolls. One theory suggested the dolls were offerings, each made during or after a ritual. Another, darker theory proposed they were tools, part of a system of control, binding a child's identity to a fragile form that could be mutilated without leaving marks on the body. But survivors remembered something different. One recalled being told to make her own doll, to color it carefully, to cut it in silence and place it under her bed before sleep. When she forgot one night, she woke to find a doll already there, one she hadn't made, with her mouth drawn shut in black ink. The deeper drawers held older dolls, some brittle with age, others warped by moisture that had somehow seeped in without staining the wood. A few had strange symbols carved into them, not in pen but with tiny blades. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a circle with 2 breaks like a mouth unable to close. It matched carvings found in the chapel's altar base and later on the inside of the sewing room door. Forensic teams noted that even the dust clinging to the edges of the drawers contained traces of desiccated tissue, bone, dried blood, ash. But never enough to trace to a full body, only fragments, as though something or someone had learned how to reduce a child into powder and reuse that dust as memory. Some dolls had string attached to their hands and ankles like puppets waiting to be moved. One was nailed to the drawer itself, pinned at its joints with sewing needles that matched those from the threading room. When investigators pulled it loose, a line of tiny holes was found beneath it, drilled into the base like a second name being erased by force. No one claimed responsibility. No one came forward. But survivors later admitted they were told to never touch the dolls, not because they were sacred, but because they were dangerous. One boy had torn his own in half during a tantrum and was never seen again. Staff said he ran away. But his doll, found years later in the cabinet's lowest drawer, was glued back together, smiling, hands folded, mouth gone. The structure was unearthed by accident when a backhoe broke through the softened earth behind the orphanage garden wall. At first, it was thought to be a shattered greenhouse, but as the dirt was cleared and the full shape revealed, what emerged was unlike anything recorded in the building's original plans. It was a glass bell, 6 feet tall, buried upside down in the soil with its flared base open at ground level. The chamber was thick-walled, reinforced by iron ribs around the rim and sealed at the top with a rusted valve system that no one could identify. Inside there was no drainage, no ladder, no signs of ventilation. Just a smooth, cold interior and a faint white residue coating the base, which forensic teams later confirmed as a mixture of calcium, blood, and keratin. human in origin. Beneath the bell, the dirt had been hollowed into a shallow basin lined with old copper piping, still capable of carrying water when tested. The system was deliberate, not decorative, and it was never meant for gardening. The survivors didn't know the name for it back then. They simply called it the clear place. Only a few remembered being brought to it, always after dusk, always wrapped in white linen soaked in something that smelled of vinegar and sugar. One girl described it as a baptism, but not the kind spoken of in church. Miss Gray would lead them in silence, whispering that their voices had grown too loud inside their own bodies, that the spirit needed space. The linen strips were wound tight around the arms and chest, binding the child like a funeral preparation. Once inside the bell, the child was told to kneel. A latch locked from the outside, then the water would begin. It did not flood fast. It rose slowly, an inch at a time, a deliberate crawl that allowed breath to remain but comfort to disappear. The water came from below, bubbling through tiny holes in the copper basin, warming unnaturally as it rose. It never reached boiling, but it carried a strange heat that left the skin red and peeled. The linen wraps would loosen in places, sometimes tear, but they were never removed. One child said Miss Gray watched from above through a fogged pane, her hand pressed flat against the glass as she mouthed words they couldn't hear. Another recalled the taste of flowers in the water, like something steeped, not poisoned, but prepared, as if the baptism was not meant to cleanse, but to steep the child in something beyond water. A transformation, a dissolving. Records hidden inside a bricked-off drawer near the chapel chimney referenced the ritual only once. The page was titled "Soul Rinse for Those Already Fading." The entry described the process as a final passage, a softening of the spirit, a way to separate the decay from the vessel before it spread. There was no mention of duration, just a phrase repeated in a loop. "They sink when ready." There was no further explanation. 17 children were confirmed missing during Miss Gray's tenure. 17 unmarked graves were assumed. But when the bell was finally lifted by crane, 17 tiny fingernail scratches were counted along the inner glass wall. Some short, others long, some circular as if tracing the edge of a face. Beneath the basin, buried in layers of silt, investigators found hair clumps and teeth, sealed in wax paper and wrapped with string. Each bundle was labeled with dates, not birth dates, not death dates, but single-day entries logged in the chapel's inventory as purified. The bell now sits in a storage unit behind county archives, draped in blackout cloth. No museum wanted it. The glass fogs without cause. The inner walls never fully dry. And even after draining, there are still days when workers swear they hear the faint echo of bubbles. Slow, rising, waiting for the last breath to surface. Behind the infirmary, hidden behind a narrow bricked alcove long thought to be part of the foundation, was a sealed doorway framed in soot and scorched wood. When demolition teams opened it in 1993, they found a room so suffocating in atmosphere even decades later that breathing became difficult within seconds. There were no windows, no vents, no visible source of light. The air was thick and sweet, the walls darkened in waves of oily residue that glistened under flashlight like layers of wax. What seemed at first like tar turned out to be something worse. Samples scraped from the wall revealed human fat, baked, condensed, and layered over time like paint. The room, later confirmed by structural records to have been added after the orphanage's original construction, was not listed anywhere. It had one purpose, and it was not medical. It was ritualistic, and it was punishment. Survivors spoke of a place only whispered about. They called it the warm room, but not with comfort. The warmth was a threat, a warning used in place of a slap. When a child was accused of stubbornness, of resisting correction, they were not scolded. They were prepared. Preparation meant fasting for a day, then being stripped and wrapped in wax-treated cloths. Thick, heavy layers saturated with a blend of oils and resin, hardened just enough to restrict movement. The cloths were not to be torn or adjusted. They were wound tight from the ankles to the throat, leaving only the face exposed. The mouth was often taped, sometimes stitched. The child was then lowered into a wooden basin built into the center of the warm room floor, barely large enough to hold their curled form. Once sealed inside, the chamber's heat would begin. Beneath the floor was a hand-built furnace system, operated from a separate crawl space. It could be stoked silently, allowing the temperature to rise in steady increments. No one ever screamed, not because the pain wasn't unbearable, but because they couldn't. The wax would begin to melt into the fabric, then into the skin. The air became so dense with heat and vapor that lungs slowed and skin blistered beneath the binding before a single cry could form. Miss Gray, according to one surviving maintenance worker, referred to the process as melting out disobedience. She believed certain traits were soft-bonded, able to be liquefied, drawn out like pus. She would sometimes sit in the corner of the room, eyes closed, gloved hands folded, counting down from 100 as the fire built. When the count reached 1, she would whisper the phrase, "Now let the wrong drip away." Several charred wax sheets were recovered during excavation, still curled and hardened in grotesque shapes resembling torsos and limbs. No bones remained inside them, only the imprints, the collapsed form of a back, the slight ridge of a chin, fingers clenched to stubs. It is believed that many of the children who entered the warm room were never taken out. Instead, the cloths were left to cool and stiffen, then stacked behind the false wall that once sealed the room. During analysis, 3 layers of fat were discovered on the interior surfaces, aged, distinct, each corresponding to different years of operation. Forensic experts agreed. It was not accidental residue. It was layered intentionally, preserved through heat and time like varnish. A coating of obedience. Miss Gray's name did not appear in any furnace records. No staff confessed to operating the system, yet every blueprint revision submitted during those years showed increasing heat damage around the infirmary, including warped beams and buckled flooring, always dismissed as faulty construction. The truth was simpler. Fire was being used as a tool, not to kill, at least not always, but to burn something invisible out of a child and leave only what could be shaped. Those who survived the warm room bore permanent damage. Scars hidden beneath clothing, eyes that avoided sunlight, skin that split easily in cold air. They spoke rarely of what it felt like. One described it as falling inward while staying awake. Another said it taught them how to disappear without dying. A few never spoke at all, as if the wax had coated not only their skin but their voice, sealing it in a silence that no heat could melt through again. The name Eunice Gray first appears in the county register in the spring of 1910, 1 year after the death of a nurse by the same name in a cholera ward in Brighton. That nurse was 32, unmarried and buried in a family plot. Her body was embalmed, identified by colleagues and mourned by distant cousins who signed her death notice. But in Lancashire, where no one had ever heard of her, someone arrived bearing her name, her qualifications, and a forged letter of appointment. The letter was typed on paper with the correct government seal, but was never filed in the proper archive. The ink used in the signature matched no known registry hand, yet no one questioned it. She was calm, respectful, devout. She spoke in the measured tones of someone used to illness. Her gloves were always clean. Her voice never rose. Her eyes did not wander. And she never once touched a child in front of another adult. What began as whispers turned into research decades later when a team of historians attempted to track the orphanage's chain of custody. They found the real Eunice Gray's grave, fully documented, cross-checked with hospital employment records. The woman at Oldham was an imposter. She had no birth certificate in the region, no fingerprints ever taken, no vaccination records. The oldest known document bearing her name was a baptism certificate for a child named Lucy Gray, listed as the sponsor. Not the mother, not the priest. The child drowned 5 weeks later. The signature at the bottom matched the writing in Oldham's medical logs. And when analysts compared that handwriting to entries made under different staff names, initials varied, pen names rotated, they found an unsettling consistency. The same hand signed everything, multiple names, multiple roles, all pointing to one person who was never photographed, never questioned, and never recorded in any census. Those who remembered her as adults described a figure that never aged. One housekeeper recalled seeing her in 1914 and again in 1924, her hair the same exact color, her posture unchanged. Others noted how she wore her uniform differently. No name tag, no apron, only a long gray coat buttoned to the neck and white gloves pulled tight to the wrists. One cook claimed that Eunice was polite, even generous. She brought extra bread for the staff, paid out of her own pocket, and donated to the church collection every Sunday. But she never stayed for the sermon. She always left during the first hymn. When pressed, not one adult could describe her smile. They said she was kind because she never interrupted. They said she was gentle because she never argued. But no one remembered her laughing. No one remembered her eating. The children's stories were different. The few who spoke her name decades later did so with an unease that outlasted memory. One boy remembered waking up with his lips burning, finding a thin line of wax across them, and seeing Miss Gray seated by his bed whispering prayers that didn't rhyme. Another girl claimed Miss Gray brushed her hair for 30 minutes without blinking. When the girl turned to look at her, she swore the matron's eyes were completely black. Not dark, but black, like glass or stone. Adults dismissed these claims as trauma-induced hallucinations. But a pattern emerged. Eunice Gray was never accused of abuse directly. Yet every child who vanished from the orphanage had her initials in their file. Every injury not explained was witnessed only by her. Every room later discovered, the warm room, the threading room, the bell chamber, had a ledger page stamped with the same initials curled in the same elegant pen. When authorities tried to trace her later, the trail ended abruptly in 1926. She simply stopped appearing. No death certificate, no pension, no forwarding address. She vanished the same way she arrived, without permission, without form, without sound. But in the back of a storage box labeled miscellaneous staff, one envelope remained. Inside was a lock of hair bound in string and a paper tag that read, "Gray, not hers." The handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. Signed again, dated years after she should have been dead. In a weathered box deep inside the county archives, buried beneath disintegrating attendance sheets and mold-eaten hymnals, a small wax cylinder phonograph was discovered wrapped in cloth and bound with red twine. It had no label, no creator mark, only a tag that read, "Preserved by request. Do not play." It was found during an inventory of abandoned church records tied to Oldham Orphanage's chapel, years after the building had been condemned. When it was finally played in a controlled forensic lab, the sound that spilled from the horn did not follow any recognizable hymn or composition. It began with breath. Long, unnatural inhalations that stretched too far and lingered too long, as if the lungs making them had no limit. Then softly came the voices. Not discordant, but wrong. The children sang in a slow, crawling rhythm, their vowels bent backward. Consonants twisted into sounds the human mouth was never meant to hold. And though the voices were clearly young, they carried the weight of something old, something that was forcing itself through them. Experts assumed it was a trick of early audio warping or the result of heat damage to the cylinder. But analysis proved otherwise. The breathing patterns, when visualized on waveform, did not match the exhalation rhythm of normal human singing. They were reversed. These children were not breathing in between phrases. They were breathing in during the words themselves, inhaling instead of exhaling, dragging sound inward as they vocalized. No editing had been done, no reversal applied. Their bodies had been trained or forced to produce song through reversed breath. One researcher, after listening to the track for hours, reported a sharp headache and uncontrollable nosebleed. The room had to be sealed, the machine placed in containment. What made it worse was that the lyrics, when studied phonetically, did resemble language. Not English, but something close to Latin, though no classical scholar could place the full translation. A fragment was eventually deciphered by a university linguist as "return what is not ours / purge what was taken." The rhythm repeated every 11 measures, and at the end of the recording a faint voice, not a child's, whispered something over the final breath. It was barely audible, but forensic audio confirmed it matched the vocal signature found on other fragments signed by E.G. The voice said, "Oh no, spirit unbound returns backward." It was not sung. It was said with certainty, like a rule that had never been broken. Survivors remembered the choir rehearsals, but they didn't call them rehearsals. They called them sessions. No one taught them notes or scales. They were told to stand still, to hold a candle, to breathe exactly when told, not when needed. One girl said she was taught to breathe in when her body screamed to breathe out, and vice versa. She described a practice where they were submerged up to the chest in water so cold their ribs locked. The cold, she claimed, made it easier to invert the breath, easier to unlearn the body's logic. Miss Gray had told them that backward breath was the only way to keep the soul from absorbing sin. The logic was never questioned, not because it made sense, but because questioning meant isolation. And isolation often meant you came back quieter, or didn't come back at all. One child lost consciousness during a session and awoke with small incisions behind both ears. No medical report was filed, but later imaging would reveal 2 paper-thin slivers of metal embedded near the auditory nerves. Their purpose remains unknown. Another survivor claimed the candles they held weren't just symbolic. They emitted a scent that made them lightheaded, docile, detached from time. She remembered the songs not as performance but as offering. A reversal, she said, not just of breath but of intention. Sound pulled inward was sound denied to the world, and in denying it they cleansed something, though no one could say what. During excavation of the chapel's east wall, beneath a collapsed storage unit, a rusted grate was found leading to a crawlspace. Inside were 11 robes, child-sized, arranged in a circle on the dirt floor. In the center, melted wax pooled into a perfect spiral, and beside it a hymnal scorched along the edges. Each page had been altered, the notes scratched away and replaced with strange glyphs. At the back of the book was a chart, 3 columns labeled vessel, sound, and retention. Under retention, the numbers never went higher than 2. Miss Gray's handwriting appeared once below the final entry. Only those who breathe against creation can hold what was never meant to stay. To this day, the recording is stored in a soundproof vault. It is not available to the public. Those who listened to it in full all reported similar symptoms: dreams of rooms without ceilings, lungs that filled with ash, and music that pulled from inside the spine rather than the ear. One technician described a voice that followed her for days, not speaking, only breathing, always backward, always closer each time. The recording lasts 5 minutes and 47 seconds, but the silence that follows feels longer. And if you listen to the very end, Past the static, there is one final inhale. Soft, high-pitched, barely audible. And it doesn't stop. Not completely. Even in the quiet, it lingers, waiting, as if breath once reversed never truly leaves again. The adoption logs from Oldham Orphanage between 1911 and 1924 paint a picture of progress. Dozens of children marked as placed, transitioned, welcomed into homes across the region. The entries were neat, consistent, stamped with forged seals of now defunct agencies, and signed in the same soft cursive that had followed the children through every record of injury, silence, and correction. Each entry listed a new family, a new address, a date of departure, and a note of praise. Well prepared, behavior corrected, fully compliant. But none of those families existed. The addresses were real enough, some now homes, others long since demolished. But the names beside them belonged to no census, no tax rolls, no telephone registries. When historians tried to trace the receiving guardians, they found brick walls at every turn. No guardians, no court filings, no school transfers. The children vanished between the ink and the dirt. Of the 62 children marked as adopted during that period, only 3 had death certificates. The rest were never accounted for until the floors of the East Dormitory began to sag during a winter thaw, and workers were called in to stabilize the foundation. When the boards were lifted, they didn't find rot or termites. They found a space no more than 2 feet high, running the full length of the building. Inside were bones, small, disorganized, wrapped in waxed cloth, some still clutching objects too fragile to name, a button sewn to a ribbon, a paper hand, a stitched scrap of muslin bearing the name Clara. Forensic teams determined the remains belonged to at least 14 different children. None bore signs of natural death. Many showed signs of intentional binding, wrists fused by cloth hardened in wax, spines twisted in angles that suggested they had been forced into position before rigor mortis. Several skulls had no lower jaws. Cleanly removed, disconnected, not shattered, each body corresponded to a name on the adoption log. The date of their supposed release matched closely to the estimated time of death, often within a day. It became clear the paperwork was not a pathway to freedom. It was a finalization ritual. The word adopted had been twisted, redefined by a mind that saw transfer not as placement but as erasure. One investigator noted that the signature line on each form bore a second, nearly invisible set of initials beneath the ink, pressed into the paper as if by a gloved hand. That mark, when magnified, revealed a curved pattern identical to the blood-ringed stamp found on the paper dolls in the cabinet. The rituals were not separate. They were layered, performed across record memory and flesh. Further excavations revealed a hidden crawl space beneath the old chapel office, sealed with bricks mismatched in color. Behind it, a second set of adoption records was found, these not typed but handwritten in what appeared to be the children's own scrawls. Lists of names, drawings of homes with no doors, stick-figure families with no faces. Some included the word "leaving," underlined again and again. One page showed a crudely drawn carriage with wheels shaped like eyes. Underneath, in a faint child's hand, were the words, "She said I'm chosen. She said I'll go where the noise can't. Find me." That phrase was repeated across 3 different entries, always in a different child's hand, always signed with the same date. Authorities closed the investigation in silence. The orphanage's final report cited record-keeping fraud and staff negligence but never mentioned ritual abuse or hidden graves. The word adoption remained in the official language, and yet survivors say they knew it was never real. They never saw the wagons arrive. They never saw goodbye. A child would be called to the chapel office and simply not return. Their bed would be made, their clothes folded, and a new paper doll would appear in the cabinet by morning. Adoption at Oldham did not mean being taken into a family. It meant being removed from history. Made flat, made silent, and buried so shallow that the earth could still remember the shape they once held. Every December 14th, without fail, the halls of Oldham Orphanage fell into a silence far deeper than the usual obedience. It was not a night of crying or prayer, not even of warning. It was a night when no one dared to breathe too loudly, when even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The children knew before they were told. They always knew. 7 would be missing by morning. Not 6, not 8, always 7. And there would be no search, no questions. Just 7 empty beds, sheets folded, shoes still placed beneath each frame. Survivors remembered the night by a single sound. Not footsteps, not whispers, but something like a dry brush dragged across concrete. It moved slowly, room to room, door to door. And when it paused, every child held still in hopes it would keep going. If it stopped at your door too long, you didn't sleep again. The records buried under loose floorboards in the chapel's side chamber documented the pattern. One journal, bound in dark blue leather, titled only Winter Offering, listed dates, initials, and strange observations. Each December 14th entry followed the same structure. A column labeled Gathered beside one labeled Returned. The second column was always blank. Alongside the names were notations written in a soft, looping hand. Responded to reversed breath. Bled from the eye and not the ear. Did not flinch at warmth. These were not punishments, they were selections. One entry dated 1918 noted all 7 matched rhythm. The bell did not resist beneath that in lighter ink. The phrase echoed 7 confirmed repeated 3 times. The term echoed 7 appears nowhere else in official orphanage files, but in a fractured wooden panel beneath the dormitory stairs, someone had carved the words in slanted script, barely visible unless lit from below. It was the only mark left by the ones who never came back. Their names were stripped from the dorm rosters, their paper dolls removed from the cabinet. But survivors remembered. Always 7, always gone before dawn. And each time the air left behind felt heavier, not from grief, but from something still present. Like the echo of a song sung backwards in a place that refused to forget what was taken. The vault was discovered by accident during the final demolition phase of the infirmary in the summer of 1992. The floor beneath the southern wing had begun to collapse, and when the crew broke through the rotted wood and concrete, they found a stairwell no one had mapped. Steep, narrow, and descending deeper than the foundation should have allowed. At the bottom was a metal door with no handle, its hinges fused with rust, its frame sealed into the stone like it had never meant to open again. The torchwork to breach it took over an hour. What spilled out wasn't dust or mold, but a scent described by the workers as sickly sweet, like rotted fruit soaked in perfume. One man vomited, another fainted, and yet they all kept going. Something about the air pulled them forward like curiosity shaped into warmth. Inside, the chamber was colder than it should have been. The walls were lined with cabinets, 31 in total, each one labeled with a date and an unfamiliar symbol. Some opened easily, revealing glass jars filled with fluid, each holding what could only be human organs. Hearts too small to be adult. Lungs that had never inhaled more than a child's cry. Several jars were marked with handwritten tags in mirror script, readable only when reversed. One tag read "Speech extracted retained." Another, beneath a jar containing a small pulsing sac, simply read, "Still alive." There was no preservation method anyone could confirm, no refrigeration, and yet nothing had rotted. Even after decades underground, the flesh inside the glass remained firm, as if time had been paused in exchange for something else. But the center of the room held the most disturbing sight. A wooden chair, high-backed and child-sized, faced the far wall. In it sat a perfectly preserved body. A child, perhaps 10 years old, dressed in a formal uniform untouched by age or decay. Their arms rested on the chair's armrests, palms up, fingers slightly curled. The skin, pale but unbroken, looked recently washed. But the eyes were open. Not naturally, but sewn that way, with gold thread looped from eyelid to brow in delicate knots. The thread shimmered under flashlight, catching in ways thread shouldn't. One forensic assistant swore it moved. Another claimed the eyes followed him, though the body remained completely still. An autopsy was never performed. The child's mouth had been sealed shut with wax. Not poured, but painted, in layers as if each coat had a purpose. Beneath the chair, carved into the floor, was a phrase in mirror script. Obedience begins with the gaze. A locked drawer beside the chair held a journal, the pages written in backward lettering and bound in skin-like parchment. The journal did not document events but intentions. Ritual diagrams, strange, formulae and entries such as spine removed, song remained, and organ displacement allowed clarity. No names, no remorse. Just method, cold, precise and patient. The vault was sealed again that night, but not before one investigator noted that the air inside the room, even with the door open, never changed temperature. It stayed cold, sweet, still, like the room knew it was being watched and waited to be needed again. When the grounds around Oldham Orphanage were finally excavated for full forensic study nearly a century too late, the expectation was to uncover forgotten remains, perhaps unmarked graves or discarded personal effects from a time when record-keeping was careless. What they found instead broke every assumption. The first discovery came from a shallow pit near the edge of the garden wall. A jumbled skeleton, too large to be a child's but with arm bones half the expected length. Closer inspection revealed something impossible. The pelvis was adult, the jawline still sharp and matured, but the femurs were short and curved unnaturally inward, and the hands were child-sized, as if the body had grown in segments that never belonged together. It was not a burial, it was an assembly. A composition made from two lives fitted without logic and left in the soil like a discarded draft. Then more bones were found, a line of them beneath the walkway between the chapel and infirmary. Some laid carefully side by side, others tangled. One body had two spines, both incomplete, fused at the base like roots forced together underground. Another had a rib cage collapsed inward and bound by thick thread, as if the chest had been sewn shut post-mortem. But it wasn't the deformities that disturbed the forensic team. It was the signatures. Nearly every bone carried a small carved mark, some initials, some symbols, some shallow words like split, held, kept. No two markings were the same, yet they shared a pattern of meaning as though each one was a result of an experiment completed. These weren't children who died. These were trials. The most grotesque discovery came from a narrow trench sealed with stones just beyond the chapel garden. There, partially intact, was a skull with no lower jaw, its eye sockets packed not with soil but with teeth, 15 in total, wedged so tightly that the bone had fractured. Some of the teeth were adult molars, others clearly baby teeth, and none belonged to the skull itself. The forensic pathologist who examined it broke protocol and left the case. They called it a head that had been turned into a mouth. At the heart of the site, buried deeper than the others and encased in thick wax, was a journal. It bore no name, but the paper matched that of the vault ledger and the adoption forms. Inside were 22 entries, each one documenting a procedure: bone inversion, identity splitting, vocal folding. The last entry was dated December 14, 1925, and written in smoothed mirror, Script, it read, "In silence they become more than flesh. They become formula. The child must be unmade to speak the shape of what lies beneath us. There was no signature. But beneath the final line, pressed faintly into the page by a gloved hand, was a familiar marking. The closed circle, broken twice. The same found in the threading room, on the dolls, and in the choir's hymnal. It was not a symbol of death. It was a seal, and whatever it sealed, it was never buried deep enough. When the Oldham revelations reached the public, it wasn't the bodies that caused the first wave of outrage. It was the paperwork, the signatures, the quietness of it all. How so many forms had passed through so many hands, adoption notices, medical logs, absence reports. And yet no one stopped to ask why the ink never changed. Why the language felt rehearsed, why every mark circled back to initials belonging to someone who never officially existed. Committees were formed, investigations opened, statements read aloud in trembling voices by those who had waited decades to be believed. Oversight laws were passed in 1993 mandating unannounced inspections of residential children's homes, fingerprinting of all staff, and digital tracking of every transfer, every injury, every death. But by then, the rooms at Oldham were empty, and Miss Gray, if she was ever real to begin with, had become a shadow cast across history with no body, no grave, and no traceable blood. A memorial stands on the site now, a smooth black wall etched only with first names. 71 in total. Some real, some maybe not. Flowers are left there, but never for long. They wilt too quickly, even in spring. Below the wall, sealed into the stone, is a brass plaque with the words, "For the unheard, the unheld, the unfinished." It is cold to the touch, even in sunlight, and still many of the records remain sealed. Whistleblowers claim Miss Gray's experiments were protected, not ignored, but studied, supported, documented by unseen institutions that viewed children as experimental thresholds, a phrase that appears more than once in restricted memos. The boxes holding those files have been locked for decades, and when you walk past the archive room where they sit, you don't hear crying, you don't hear screams, you only hear the quiet sound of paper, being turned but never read aloud,